A lot comes to mind when people talk about the success and failure of teams in the NBA, but I'm here to talk a little bit more about how a team's fan base can affect their performance. The reason why I chose this topic is because I used to play basketball when I was younger, and so in general the sport interests me. I'm also a fan of the Toronto Raptors, and recognizing last year how successful the season was, I realized that the Raptors had such a large and supportive fan base and wanted to see a little bit more if this had a big impact on their performance. Since there is a high following for basketball and specifically the NBA, I believe there will be a greater and stronger correlation between the size of a fan base to the number of wins a team has. Because if a team has a good supportive fan base, it can result in a team winning more games. The type of bias that could come up in the CCT could potentially be unintentional bias. I don't know exactly where the stats are coming from in the NBA, and I'm not fully aware of the influences that are presented in the data. The variables I am looking at in the CCT are social media followers for the team's pages, the home attendance throughout the 2015 season, the total number of wins in the 2015 season, and the total number of times that each team has made playoffs. Analyzing the histogram box plot for the social media followers, it shows the frequency of how many teams have a certain amount of followers and demonstrates that most of the teams have less than 1 million followers based on the data. The summary chart states that the average number of social media followers a team has is about 1.293 million, which is close to where most of the data falls under. However, is a bit more than where it should be in this case because the median is more accurate. Even though most of the data is in this category, there are a few teams that are major outliers in terms of the data trend, as those teams are well over 2 million followers and range to roughly 4 to 6 million. These outliers skewed the data, making the range slightly higher because the outliers cause the total average to go up and therefore leaving the mean to not be an accurate count of where most of the teams fall under. The histogram shows one major outlier as this team only had about 100,000 people total throughout the whole season to go watch a home game, when meanwhile the central spread of the data is in between 700,000 to 800,000. The total spread of the data is quite large based on the minimum and maximum values provided in the summary chart, which relates to why the standard deviation is as high as it is. The higher standard deviation, the larger the spread of the data. The consistency of the data is good within the center, however the major outlier causes the data to be skewed and causes the maximum and minimum values to be spread further apart. The IQR is 100,886 people in attendance, which is known to be the center of the data. The amount of wins throughout the 2015-2016 season demonstrates a range of about 35 wins to 55 wins throughout all the teams in last year's season. The mean in the summary chart is shown evidently on the box plot and states that the average wins the team had last year was 41, which makes sense with the histogram average, that if you notice that a large portion of the data and the frequency of the teams lays on the 40 wins mark. The spread of the data is quite small as the box plot is not spread apart, meaning that the IQR, or the center of the data, when calculated would be a smaller number. This represents that the center of the data is close together in terms of how many data points is spread apart and shows that the mean is almost in the center of the box plot. There are two major outliers that have somewhat of an effect on the data. However, since the mean is quite accurate, they do not have a large effect on the average. It is quite evident that in the histogram, most of the teams throughout the NBA history have made playoffs in between roughly 5 to 45 times, and therefore the spread is quite large. There are two outlier teams being at about 55 to 60 playoffs ever. In the summary chart, it shows the mean or average to be making 27 playoffs, which makes sense with the data as most of the teams fall around making 30 playoffs in their history. Even though there are two outliers, they're not completely irrelevant or away from the general trend of the data. However, they're a little bit higher than the rest of the teams. The standard deviation is on the lower side, which correlates to the data because there is somewhat of a consistency and the outliers are not completely off of the trend, which tells us that the trend is consistent. The spread can also be shown through the minimum and maximum values, as the minimum value is 27 and the max is 60, and the data followed quite consistent in between. The graph of the scatter plot social media followers to wins is a positive weak correlation. I know the correlation is weak based off the R value that is given in the graph that the number is very close to 0. Also, looking at the scatter plot, you can easily tell the correlation is weaker because the dots are more spread across the graph. The correlation coefficient is positive because the slope is increasing from left to right in a gradual positive correlation. The slope is not steep at all, so this means that even though the correlation is positive and supports the thesis, the fan base will insist in winning, it does not go up or spike at all, representing the effect that the social media followers has on the team is slim. Correlation between the home attendance to the number of wins in a season has a positive moderate correlation. The correlation is moderate because the R value on the graph is 0.53, and looking at the points, they are fairly plotted in a linear trend in which they generally follow. However, there are a few major outliers that would skew this data and can be discussed at the end, and therefore is the reason why the correlation is not strong. The correlation coefficient supports my thesis as the slope of the graph is positive and moving in an upward direction from left to right, representing that there is a high home attendance of the team, their wins will go up. This means that the home attendance will have a moderate impact on the amount of wins a team has, but not in a major way since the relation is moderate. The relation between the home attendance to the number of times a team has made it to the playoffs has a weak positive correlation. The correlation is weak because the R value in the graph is close to 0, and looking at the plots, they are quite spread out, especially since there are a few outliers that would skew this data set. The correlation coefficient supports my thesis as the other graphs do, and the slope of the graph is a positive and moving in the upward direction from left to right, representing that if there is a high home attendance of the team, their chances of going to the playoffs is higher as their wins go up. This represents that the home attendance will have somewhat of an impact on the wins, but not in a very impactful way as the relation is quite weak. The slope is not very steep at all, so this could mean that it has a very small increase. The relation between social media followers to the amount of times a team is made to the playoffs has a positive moderate correlation. The correlation is positive because the R value is in the center of the spectrum, and looking on the graph, the plots are not close enough together to be strong, however they aren't too far apart to make it a weak correlation between the two variables. The correlation coefficient supports my thesis as the more social media followers a team has, aka fans that care for the team and support them, the team would result in getting more times to the playoffs. The slope of this graph is steeper than the other graphs, and the steepness of this graph indicates that the greater the amount of Twitter followers a team has, the more times a team has made it to the playoffs, and also relates to the amount of wins the team has been able to pull off. In conclusion, my thesis was not fully proven based on the data provided. What I've noticed from the relations is that the Fathom graphs in the data shows either a weak or moderate correlation. What this tells me is that two variables have a relation and effect on each other. However, there are many outside factors that can lead to a team's success, and the fan base is just one small factor of the team's success. My predictions were that there would be a strong correlation between all of the variables. This is because, in my opinion, when a team feels and has a good support system, they will be successful because they would feel a sense of confidence to play. However, the correlations stated before were either weak or moderate. I believe that the experiment did not work because the data I used from websites gave numbers and stats where there was no explanation to where they got it. The extraneous variables are the causes and the effects of the data and why the correlations were weaker, such as some towns and cities of certain teams have different populations, which can be an outside effect on the team's home attendance and the amount of people that can actually attend games. There's also random people following teams on social media that don't necessarily support the team but are counting that number. Some teams have bigger recognition because of who might represent them. For example, Kobe Bryant represents the Lakers, however the Lakers aren't the best team in the NBA. Some teams are from larger cities and become more popular because of that. Some teams have larger budgets that can result in well-paid player salaries and more resources for the team, which would definitely assist in the team's success. Some teams just have better coaches than others that can be really important when it comes to games and how coaches can develop their players. And sometimes the extraneous variable can be the fact that some teams just have some of the best players, and you can relate to last year's NBA final where you had Cleveland and the Golden State, which have each team has one of the best players in the whole entire league, Golden State has Stephen Curry, the highest point scorer, and LeBron James, one of the most athletic players in all of the NBA. And in conclusion, all these variables had a large factoring in why the correlations weren't as strong as they were, as a team's fan base does have an effect on their performance. However, it's not the only factoring in this situation.